All right, well, welcome everybody. Welcome back to our second housing briefing. Thank you if you've joined us in the beginning of the year. And so this is the 2026 post-session housing briefing. Of course, we have housing chair here for the House side, Representative Luke Evslin, and we've got Senator Chang, chair of the HOU Senate Committee. And so the point of this is really just to highlight some of their key bills that we've been sent to the governor for approval and what we've passed this year. And with that, I want to open up the floor to Representative Evslin to take us away with his presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Maka. Maka is my office manager here. Thanks for the intro. Thank you, Maka, also for making this slideshow. And as we were just joking, digging deep and finding out maybe the single picture of me smiling here in a committee hearing this year. Appreciate that. But no, thank you to Senator Chang for always motivating and setting these pre and post session briefings up. I really appreciate that. Appreciate the collaboration and the work with Senator Chang this year and for the previous few years. And then, of course, thank you to Senator Chang's staff, Ruben, and all of his other staff who has been great to work with all session and who worked hard to get this set up. And thank you to you all who are here in person and online and saw our repeated time changes. I'm glad you guys stuck with us here and are still here. And then throughout session, thank you to all the stakeholders. HFTC, Dean Minakami, thank you for responding to my texts at 7 in the morning or 10:30 at night or whenever it is, and really staying engaged throughout the whole session. But all the rest too, HCDA and OPSD and the counties. I see Gavin here. Thank you for your work. Lindsay with the Gov's office, and all the home builders who stayed engaged with this whole process. And then, of course, thank you to all of the advocates. Also who have been really instrumental throughout this session in staying engaged and pushing us hard. And then lastly, thank you to the other senators, other than Senator Chang, who I was able to work with closely this session, including Senator Sashimoto and Wakai and Lee and Elefante, and certainly the House leadership, who has been really supportive of our efforts here on the housing front. That said, we'll dive into our slideshow. If you go to the first slide. Oh, is this the old version?
Sorry, there's a new version on Teams that I sent this morning.
It's okay. You don't got to do it. You can just go to that intro slide and I'll summarize. So the only slide that's missing from our slideshow here is the UHERO's fact book came out last week, and the UHERO every year does a housing fact book, which is an update on our housing crisis in Hawaii. And the introductory page of that housing fact book, I think, is like the best one-page summary of the housing crisis that I have probably seen in Hawaii. It very, very clearly says that our crisis is a crisis of not building enough homes, right? As it says, quote, "Solution is relatively clear. Hawaii must significantly expand its housing supply to reverse its population decline and restore affordability." It goes on to say essentially that policy really matters here. It highlights Maui County as a policy that has been successful in actually bringing prices down. Their policy of phasing out thousands of short-term rentals. Yes, this is controversial, but it certainly has made an impact, and it's at the scale I think we need to be moving at. And then it calls out, Honolulu County for some public officials pushing back on the development of more housing as something that can be problematic as we work towards building more housing. I think it's really important to acknowledge the need for a lot more housing. And it's like step one of this problem is like acknowledge the problem. And we need to build, depending on what estimate you're looking at, 50, 60, 70,000 more homes in the next couple of years just to meet the demand. And I think most people aren't even really at step one of acknowledging that problem. But once we acknowledge that we need to build a lot more homes, then in a lot of ways, it's like the harder part of the problem is how do we then have this community conversation around how do we build all of these homes while creating vibrant communities, while improving the quality of life in Hawaii, which I really believe we can do. How do we build the homes in a way that's not consuming agricultural land and forcing us to build out infrastructure in a way that's incredibly inefficient and is like a debt time bomb for future generations? How do we do it in a way that's not forcing people into really long commutes? This is all the hard problems that we're facing. And we're not even really there and having that conversation because we're still stuck at step one of do we need to build more homes? And so I think read the UHERO fact book. It is very clear we need to build a lot more homes. I think, I view the solution as sort of three buckets, which I'll get into in my presentation. But bucket one is like regulatory reform. We need to make it easier to build housing. This is partially just a crisis of our own making, that we've made it really, really hard to build housing. So this is zoning and regulatory reform, building code reform, trying to simplify those processes as much as possible. Step two is infrastructure, right? Ensuring that we have the infrastructure in place that we can build housing, especially high density housing within our town cores. And then number three is financing, right? Especially in a high interest rate environment, low interest financing is going to be critical. In a lot of ways, we need it's like a three-legged stool. We need all three of those in place to be able to build the housing. And if any one is missing, we're really not going to be able to do it. This session, I would say that on the regulatory reform front, we did not do very well. We had, I think, a lot of proposed policies out there on the regulatory reform front, and the vast majority of those died. There were some successes, which I'll get into, but I don't think we're sort of moving at the pace necessary on the regulatory reform front. On infrastructure, we did, I would say, pretty well. RISE bonds, which we're going to get into, I think is a huge success. There's a proposed CONAM. If that passes, that's going to be huge. So infrastructure, I think we're doing, did pretty well this session. And then on financing, I'd say we did really well. There's a lot of money towards, Rent Housing Revolving Fund got an additional $50 million infusion. That's $250 million total over 2 years. There's $250 million total in this budget towards housing. The extension of the LIHTC credit and the transferability of the LIHTC credit and the RHRF reform, which I'm sure Senator Chang is going to get into. I think all of that was really critical. So I think on financing, we did well. Lastly, I'll just sort of close this out so I can begin the actual presentation, is that I'm like perpetually optimistic. I wouldn't be doing this job if I didn't think that we could solve the housing crisis, and that we could solve it in a way that helps improve our communities. I would say we are not necessarily meeting the problem at the moment, right? We're not moving at the scale necessary to actually solve this problem. On Kauai, for example, as the fact book says, we lost 500 homes over the last 5 years, right? We're actually going backwards in some places. And so we're not necessarily meeting the moment. And if we continue down this trajectory, I really feel like Hawaii is just going to become a home for millionaires, and our kids will not be able to afford to live here. We are going to lose our communities. And lastly, as housing committee chair, I take this role incredibly seriously. I don't want my kids to graduate college and not be able to move home and be like, Dad, you were housing committee chair. What did you do? So I really we have this, next, 5, 6, 7 years to really try and solve this. And if we don't, then we're in trouble. So all of my effort will, hey, nice job. There's our slide. All of my efforts will continue to be to, collaborate here and make sure that we are making progress at the pace and scale that we need to make progress. All right. Let me just finish on one quick optimistic note. I really, really firmly believe that we can build a lot of housing in a way that improves our communities. I want to finish with that. We can do this in a way that helps revitalize our town cores, that helps support small businesses, that helps create vibrant community spaces where the public can meet. And when we do it, then we can ensure that a teacher can afford to live in Hawaii and be a teacher. You can ensure that young people can afford to start a job without breaking the bank, et cetera, because they're spending all their money on housing. So I am a firm believer that this is possible. We just got to take the bold steps necessary. All right, first slide. So I'm going to run pretty quickly through what we passed this year. This was introduced by Representative Miyake, the Vice Chair of the Housing Committee. This is it continues a lot of the work on SHPD reform that we passed last year, establishes firm SHPD review deadlines, and streamlines approval and limits additional SHPD review once a project concurrence is granted. SHPD, I think, is doing the best work that they can. We have in a lot of ways, saddled them with this overly broad mandate, which is slowing down project approvals significantly. And so one aspect of ensuring that they can do their work is adequately staffing them, and another aspect is ensuring that we are not, sending every 50-year-old culvert to SHPD for review. So we'll continue, this work on the SHPD, streamlining SHPD. And I appreciate Jessica Puff, SHPD administrator, for all of her collaboration on this front. Next. This also was introduced by Vice Chair Miyake, This is continued effort at school impact fee reform. So last year we passed some significant school impact fee reform. School impact fees are $4,000 to $5,000, per unit fees that are charged on most development in Hawaii. They have never been used for school construction at all. They sit in an account, and it's really just a tax on housing for truly no reason. So last year we passed, we've tried to entirely abolish the program the last 2 years, basically. But what we keep on doing, it gets hard when you're entirely eliminating it. So last year we made big progress, essentially exempting projects under 100. This expands that to exempting projects under 500 units. And then it clarifies, so the LUC, if somebody's going through, the boundary amendment process or trying to rezone land through the LUC, the Land Use Commission has the full authority to take an exaction, right? If somebody's doing a large development, then that development should be providing a lot of affordable, or should be, helping provide the land for schools. The LUC has the authority to take that land. They continue to retain that authority, but this just sets up some timeframes for, like, if they require that land gets set aside for a school, then it's only fair that the state builds a school at some point. So what has often happened in these cases is essentially the state just says that land has to be a school, but developer, you're going to sit on and maintain this land for the foreseeable future. And they're paying property taxes on it, they're paying to maintain it, especially with fire risk, they're having to mow that land. And then it can be a blight in some of these communities that you just have this, unused land in the center of a community. So this just sets essentially some time frames for the required development of that land into a school, or it goes back. Next. This has been HB 1718 provides the counties with authority to develop mixed-use projects. So this is a problem which I don't even think people really realize was in statute, that counties didn't have the clear statutory authority to develop mixed-use projects. As city and county tries to develop BVLA, this is a real problem, that they can't get the bond financing to do this without that clear authority. 2 years ago, we passed Act 45, which gave counties this authority, but sunsetted the authority in 5 years, so counties couldn't, bond finance this with a sunsetted authority. This, I'd say, is half a loaf, as Senator Chang has told me, that essentially a step in the right direction, that we are giving the counties the authority to bond finance this, or to develop mixed-use projects. As long as they do a project within the next 5 years, that project will essentially be, grandfathered in, but then that authority sunsets in 2033, which will have to then re-extend it or hopefully make it permanent. It's also limited to just TODs. In the long run, I think we need to expand that. I don't think there should be any limits on a county's ability to do mixed use. But it's definitely a step in the right direction. It will allow counties to do the bond financing necessary to develop mixed use projects. Next. Last year we passed the self-certification program. Essentially gives architects and engineers the ability to self-certify a project if it hasn't been approved by a county within 60 days. Lots of other places have this. Like, the architect can just say this thing isn't compliant with all code, and the county will have to approve that project. So again, that kicks in after 60 days. There were some issues last year with the indemnification and the liability insurance language, which would have made this essentially impossible for counties, architects and engineers to do. So this fixed that to hopefully make this self-certification program workable. Next. This is right now, some of the counties, certainly Kauai, prohibit rainwater catchment systems on properties that already have an existing water meter. Well, what's happening in a lot of places is that there's water meter restrictions, meaning you can get a meter for your first home, but then you can't get a meter for any additional units after that. So there's, anecdotally been situations where somebody tries to permit an ADU, they hire an architect, they go through the permitting process, and then after all of this work, on the back end, the water department comes back and says, oh, sorry, there's no more water for your property. We can't give you a permit. And even if the person wanted to do water catchment, because they already have one existing meter for their main house, the county won't allow them to do water catchment. So this just says counties have to allow it. This will be honestly a game changer for some of our rural places on Kauai. Next. This bill essentially requires that counties are allowing accessory units on agricultural land, but it puts some guardrails on those units. So they have to be under 800 square feet, and they cannot be CPR'd off from the main house. Like, I want to be clear, I've always been really skeptical around ADUs on ag land. I think that can be detrimental when you have sort of an unrestricted building footprint and the ability to CPR off these units. I think the eventual outcome would be essentially the chopping up of our agricultural land into lots that are too small to farm. and it would increase, speculation and value on ag land, making it that much harder to farm. So this is allowing it, but putting guardrails on, right? If you can't CPR off the unit and it's limited in size, I think that limits speculation. I think that the most likely outcome is family members or, relatively affordable rentals in these units without leading to the chopping up of agricultural land. Next. HB 1740 is, currently, as I'm sure all of you guys in this room know, but 21H-38 allows essentially for the waiver of certain zoning and building codes and fees if somebody commits to doing a development that the majority of units are affordable. Senator Chang worked hard last year to set up what we call the alternative pathway within 201H to essentially, especially in like a high interest rate environment, to say, okay, instead of having a majority of the units be affordable, and in 201H-38, those units only have to be affordable for 10 years. After 10 years, anybody can do whatever they want. So instead of that, which there's a trade-off there, to say 100% of the units have to be owner-occupied essentially forever. This is modifying that a little bit just to say that 80% of the units would have to be deed restricted, so no income restrictions, just 80% of the units deed restricted to ensure that they are only eligible to qualified residents to buy. To be a qualified resident, you have to be living in Hawaii. So essentially to buy one of these units, you have to be domiciled in the state, and you have to be, the unit has to be occupied at all times. The bill also frees up the definition of qualified resident. So currently, if you get a unit that was developed through an H project, you can only own a single house, right? You cannot, it's only eligible to those who own no other property. So what happens often is if somebody buys, say, a studio, and then they get married and have children, they can never upsize. They can't buy a bigger unit because you're not allowed to buy another home and then sell your old home. So it really prohibits upsizing. It also prohibits downsizing. Your kids move out and you want to downsize the unit. So this gives more flexibility by saying you can own another unit, but you just have to sell that unit within 2 years. The idea being let somebody move up or move down and buy different units. So this, I think, could also be a game changer. Like the idea is by ensuring a perpetual deed restriction that we are getting these homes to be like this locals only market separate from our primary housing market. Next. This bill is confusing to explain, and it's probably the one that I'll spend the most time on. So currently every county has a inclusionary mandate, right? Where essentially if you're doing a development, a certain percentage of homes in that development have to be affordable. So all the counties, for the most part, are doing like between 20 and 30% set-asides. So for example, Kauai adopted their policy in 2008, requiring 30% of homes in any development of over 9 units to be affordable. Between 2008 and 2020, that policy produced 0 affordable units. It never once was triggered. And because essentially once a developer went over that 9-unit threshold, development became infeasible. And the reason it becomes infeasible is because those 30% of units that have to be sold affordably are having to get sold below cost, like literally below their cost of construction. So in order to pencil this out, a developer has to make the market price units more expensive, right? They're shifting the cost to the market price units to subsidize the below market units. And this shows up in nationwide evidence that the only projects, if you have too high of an inclusionary requirement, that the only projects that can pencil essentially are luxury projects that can afford to subsidize the below market ones. Kauai in 2019-ish, commissioned a study to look into our IZ policy. That study came back saying very clearly it hadn't produced any units and that it was making development infeasible for higher density units. It essentially made it impossible to develop a condo, an apartment, or multifamily townhome, et cetera. And it recommended changes, which Kauai has done. And so what this is saying is essentially asking every county to do a similar type of study. Just do, commission a study to look at the impact of your policies to make sure that these policies are sort of grounded in some type of reality, that whatever you're charging, is proportionate to the impact of that development, and to ensure that you are not suppressing production through your policies. So if this study comes back and says, no, you put things too high and it's making condos and apartments infeasible, then a county would have to lower the requirements, the affordable set-asides for condos and apartments. I think that this could be a game changer across Hawaii. And it's not only Kauai's policy that's failed, right? Essentially every county's policies have failed. Honolulu County, similar evidence from UHERO showing it's not producing any units. An example, real quick, of a successful inclusionary policy is 201H38, right? We are giving developers through 201H incentives to provide a bunch of affordable housing. The problem with the county policies is that they're not providing the incentives. Everybody has to do it, which forces the cost shift onto the market rate units. All right, next. HB 1920, this is why, part of why I said that we were successful on the financing front. This extends the state LIHTC credit, which is a critical financing tool for a critical component of financing for affordable housing projects. And it allows transferability of LIHTC credits. So currently, essentially, like banks and insurance companies, as I understand, are the primary beneficiaries of LIHTC credits. They traditionally have had large tax burdens, and they can offset these through LIHTC credits. With all the turmoil in the insurance market, insurers have sort of backed out of this market, making relatively little uptake in folks with a tax liability big enough to purchase LIHTC credits, which helps finance the projects. This allows transferability, so smaller scale people who wanting to offset their taxes could purchase these credits, which very, very importantly ensures that essentially developers can get more per dollar of tax credit are going to get more towards their development, which is critical to ensuring that we can get affordable housing projects to pencil out and finance. Next. I'm not going to go over this because Senator Chang is going to. And this last one, I will, because I don't believe it's probably not on Senator Chang's list. But this just ensures that counties are disclosing where water is and is not through an online database. Currently, it can be hard to know. You got to put in a request to the water departments to say, do I have water or not? This just says, show us where your service locations are and give us a list of areas that have water meter restrictions. And then provide on your website an easily accessible form where somebody can just submit that form and say, do I have water available? And if the county says yes, then you have 90 days essentially to get your permit, and they're guaranteeing you water for that time period. I believe that's it. Oh, sorry. I'm not going to go over all these. So I got 2 pages of bills that died. So as I said in the beginning, right, mixed success. Most of the regulatory reform stuff did die. The things that would make it easier to build housing, right? The themes here were making it easier to do manufactured housing, making it easier to do tiny homes on wheels, significant building code reform, trying to make it reducing building code requirements for triplexes and fourplexes and standardizing our code statewide. Allowing for smaller homes. Hawaii currently has very large minimum lot sizes across Hawaii. Most of the cost of a home is baked into the cost of that land, so allowing smaller lot sizes. Giving counties a little more flexibility to amend district boundaries. So right now a county can do, essentially rezone ag to urban up to 15 acres, basically unrestricted. This bill, which I think would have been a really good bill, said a county could go up to 25 acres with a whole lot of caveats, right? It had to be adjacent to an existing urban area. It had to be for affordable or ag or workforce housing, and it could only be on marginal, low quality farmland. That bill generated a ton of opposition, shockingly, just to give them an extra 10 acres with all these caveats, which is just sort of goes to show how hard it is to make these changes when even this sort of incremental step in the right direction gets flooded in opposition. I don't really understand it. Next is, HB 1739 would have required that counties allow for essentially more housing to be built near TOD. That bill also died. Next. The conveyance tax, I just want to spend one moment to talk about this. Conveyance tax was controversial. I'd say the rates that we ended up with broad House and Senate agreement, the bill didn't pass, but the rates that we got to in conference would have led to no tax increase on homes over $4 million that are owner occupied. It would have eliminated conveyance tax for homes under $600,000. It creates a marginal rate. So a home at $1 million is paying tax on only $400,000 of value, and that would be a very low tax rate. So essentially really big reductions in the conveyance tax for most homes under $4 million. It would have raised it for homes over $4 million, but it wouldn't have raised it any higher than other places like New York and California and Seattle and Philadelphia, places like that are doing on these other homes. It would have just sort of brought us to what these other high housing cost locations are doing. And so even with significant reductions in conveyance tax on homes under $4 million, it still would have raised $120 million. And the bill would have dedicated $60 million to DHL and $40 million to infrastructure. That bill died. I feel like once you dive into those rates, I think it's inevitable that we're going to have conveyance tax reform. Sorry, it also would have significantly reduced conveyance taxes on apartments. And so we'll be trying again next year on that. One more, which died again in ways that I don't really understand, like allowing cesspools. So right now, we have lots of support or not lots, we have some support for homes to convert from a cesspool to a septic system in areas that are close to the ocean, right? Priority 1 and priority 2 areas. We have a statewide prohibition on anybody getting a building permit if they have an existing cesspool. What's happening is you have people who are far from water resources who have that same prohibition. They cannot get a building permit, meaning they couldn't add an extra bedroom for their kids to move back home with them, yet they are very unlikely to be impacting water resources. All this bill would have done is saying, essentially, if you're in one of these priority 3 areas and the state has determined additionally that you're not impacting water quality, then you can get a building permit with an existing cesspool, no more than 5 units total. That bill also died. Anyway, that's all I've got. All this goes to show is that we've got a lot of work ahead of us still, and probably most of what died last year we'll be trying again on. If any of you guys watching are interested in any of that, I'd love to have a conversation. We've got the next 7 months to sort of get these bills right. Now is the time during interim when all of the hard work on developing legislation happens. So get involved now before session begins. And lastly is that if you're watching online or if you're here in person, you guys are among probably the super advocates, right? We really need you engaged in this conversation, and we're not going to make progress without it. So please reach out and let's work on this stuff together. And then most importantly, next year, your voices are incredibly important. So become active in this process if you are not already. All right, thank you.
Also, thank you so much, Representative Evslin. I want to pass the mic over to Senator Chang now, and he's going to take us through the Senate front.
Thank you so much, Maka. I want to first acknowledge that this has been a very successful session. I think it was one of the most productive sessions that I've had in my 8 years as housing chair here in the Senate. And it would not have been possible without the blood, sweat, and tears of many individuals, starting with our staff, Committee Clerk Casey Shoji, Office Manager Ruben Sierra, who's also working our IT today, and Legislative Assistant Zephanie Smith-Eisenstadt. I want to give Casey special recognition since he was working around the clock, literally, during conference, and then again yesterday to put these slides together on extremely short notice. I also want to thank our Vice Chair, Senator Troy Hashimoto and his team, as well as Ways and Means Chair, Donovan Dela Cruz and his staff. And I also want to thank Representative Luke Evslin, the House Housing Chair, for the last 3 years, whose tireless work, passion for housing, and eternal optimism have resulted in landmark housing legislation in just 3 short years. It's been a true honor and a pleasure working with you. So next. Since I have been housing chair now for 8 years, I thought it might be a good time to take a look back over what we've accomplished and the state of the housing situation here in Hawaii over the last 8 years. This is a picture of me from my first session as the housing chair, and this is what I looked like as of last year. All those wrinkles coming out.
You look the same.
Next. We had 4 different House counterparts over the last 8 years, including now Speaker of the House Nadine Nakamura and now Vice Chair in the Senate Housing Committee Troy Hashimoto. Next, we also have had 3 different House Finance Chairs and 2 different House Speakers. Next. We've had 2 governors. We've had 1 Senate President and we've had 1 Ways and Means Chair during this period. We've had 3 different HHFDC executive directors, and we've had 1 HPHA executive director. So there's been a lot of turnover in a lot of the key positions here in housing policy at the state of Hawaii. And a lot of different people have tried to add their 2 cents to housing policy. What has actually happened? So unfortunately, it's not a pretty picture. As you can see, the Oahu median single-family home price has gone up by over 50% since 2018 to $1.2 million today. The second column, not sure what happened to the header there, but that's the condo median resale price, which has also shot up by 25%, although That's still considered relatively soft, and I think that's not outpaced inflation. So condos are a relatively soft sector of the market. So this is the real bad news. Housing affordability has gone way down. Back in 2018, a household needed to make $140,000 to pay the median monthly home payment of $3,500 a month. Today, because home prices have not gone down, they've gone up, and interest rates have not gone down, they've actually shot up. You need almost twice as much money, almost $6,000 a month to make the median monthly house payment. And so therefore you need a household income of $255,000 per year. In a nutshell, the housing market is worse in almost every conceivable way today than it was 8 years ago when I became the housing chair. Next. We've done a lot to try to stimulate housing production here in the state of Hawaii. As you can see from this graph, we have utterly failed. 2016, 2018 do not register on this chart. All of these great bills that we've worked on over the last 8 years have not produced any increase in the amount of housing that's being built. And as I've stated in the past, that huge increase in housing production back in the post-war era starts to look now more like the anomaly rather than the norm. And despite all of our hard work, again, we have utterly and abjectly failed. Now, that's not to say that the legislature hasn't done a lot. So one thing that Representative Evslin didn't really get into is what I believe to be the legislature's major initiative on housing over the last decade. Back in 2016, the House of Representatives commissioned a report on affordable rental housing. It, among other things, listed state properties, categorized them A, B, and C on the availability of infrastructure. But that kicked off a now 12-year effort, largely led by the State House of Representatives, to dump huge amounts of money into this fund, the Rental Housing Revolving Fund, which is the main source of state subsidy for low-income housing. It's usually used as a match for the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, a federal program that's existed since 1986 to subsidize the construction of low-income housing. As you can see, during the peak year of 2023, $372 million went into that fund, compared to 2011, only $10 million went into that fund from the legislature. While those eye-popping numbers of $269 million, $331 million, $372 million have not recurred since 2023. In 2024, over $100 million, 2025 also over $100 million, and this year, 2026, we were all sold a bill of goods that this was an extremely budget-constrained year. The legislature, in its wisdom, not just maintained the $100 million in discretionary adds to the Rental Housing Revolving Fund, it added another $50 million. So over $180 million went into this Rental Housing Revolving Fund, again, largely to construct low-income housing here in the state of Hawaii. I am extremely distressed by this turn of events. I think that this low-income housing tax credit model is the single least efficient way to subsidize housing in the state of Hawaii, with some possible exceptions that we'll get to in the future. And in many cases, the administration has not even requested these large sums of money, including in this year. And I don't know what it is about the State House of Representatives. Like I said, there's been a lot of turnover there in leadership over the last 8 years. Yet this seems to be a consistent pattern, a consistent priority there. And if there was some way that I could move this needle, I would, but I have yet to crack that code. So, I would say this has been a disappointment for me over the last 8 years. As a result of this extremely lavish funding, the state affordable housing now dominates the entire housing construction pipeline. We talk about market rate housing, we talk about the free market. That has shriveled to an probably a smaller fraction of there's probably less market rate housing being built today than, maybe, I don't even know, maybe in centuries, because this huge amount of state financing has become available. It has crowded out all the private sector lenders. As I've pointed out multiple times in the past, we have a mild-mannered, civil servant who worked his way through the ranks, Dean Minakami, who now finances more housing than all the big buck CEOs on Bishop Street put together. And we can talk about the merits of these last decade plus of housing financing, but I think what we can conclude is that this has not meaningfully changed the lived experience for the vast majority of local people on the ground here in Hawaii, which is why all of the trends that we've talked about, the housing exodus, the outflow of Native Hawaiians from Hawaii, the impossibility of young people to make it work, all of those trends have been exacerbated over the last decade. Like I said, the private sector developers have just been drawn like moths to this irresistible flame of very, very cheap state and federal financing. In the last 2026 round of applications for these state funds, LIHTC financing is, of course, still greatly oversubscribed. The bond cap, the HMMF bond cap, is oversubscribed by more than double, and the rental housing revolving fund is oversubscribed by more than 7 times. Developers just can't get their hands on enough of this money, and they line up like hungry dogs for the amount of money that is available. There's only $131 million in rental housing revolving fund available, and developers have asked for almost $1 billion of this funding. This funding has been hitting the streets. Here's several projects that have been built. Here are 2 here on Oahu. Next, we have one on Lihue, one in Kailua Kona on the Big Island, and finally, we have one here in Maui County. And like I said, I think we have to recognize that financing package is the single biggest state initiative on housing over the last decade, and we have to ask ourselves, what, if anything, has this $1 billion plus in financing bought for us? That's not to say that there haven't been other strands. Another major one is this upzoning deregulatory strain that a number of people have worked on across the country. This is probably the showpiece of those efforts back in 2024, Senate Bill 3202, which requires the counties to allow at least 2 ADUs on all of their residentially zoned lots. It contained a number of consequences if counties did not do so, including these counties must authorize 2 ADUs on half the number of the units in the 5-year projection of the demand in the 2019 Hawaii Housing Planning Study. So that would be about 11,000 units on Oahu. It would also require ADUs to be allowed within reasonable walking distance of mass transit and federally funded highways. And finally, Oahu in particular must evaluate the development potential of apartment zones to create a full 5 years worth of demand, or 22,000 units. So the other 3 counties besides Oahu had already allowed 2 ADUs per residential lot. I think and that predated really this statute in most cases. Like I said, we haven't seen an increase in housing construction, and in those previous graphs, the ADU construction would be, not visible to the eye because it was really such a small fraction of all the housing construction statewide. Oahu has responded to the mandates. So next, Bill 64 Bill 64 2023, which I believe was adopted in early 2025, actually did allow 1 ADU plus 1 Ohana unit for every single family lot on the island of Oahu. It's not clear whether that complies with SB 3202. It depends on whether we consider an Ohana unit substantially equivalent to an ADU. Ohana units have various restrictions that differ from ADUs, including the requirement that blood relatives live in those Ohana units, whereas no such restriction exists for ADUs. But the bottom line is now these 2 units are now available on every single family lot, where only 1 was previously available, and we have not seen a measurable increase in the number of Ohana or ADU applications at DPP here on Oahu. Next, more recently, Bill 6, signed earlier this year at the City Council, makes several changes to apartment and apartment mixed use zoning here on Oahu. It reduced minimum lot sizes. It reduced minimum width and depth requirements to only 60 feet. It also increased FAR to 4.0, which I think does comply with the apartment requirements in SB 3202. So this probably unlocks another 20,000 plus units island-wide. It was just signed into law, so we're not sure yet what the implications will be. So that is, an outstanding question. Those two programs are on top of the existing Bill 7 2019 program. It's gotten a lot of discussion at the city. It allows greater height, greater density, again, 4 FAR, 0 off-street parking, 4 apartment unit zoned parcels, as long as 80% of the units are affordable to 100% of AMI for 15 years. That's actually a fairly high rent level. It's not clear to me that that's lower than market, in fact. In 2024, the council added cash grants of, I think, $12,000 a unit, or I'm not sure, either $10,000 or $15,000 per unit. Also, DPP must approve these applications within 90 days, although I'm not sure whether that's actually happened or not. As of early 2026, a total of 6 of these projects have been completed, adding 189 units of housing stock to the island of Oahu in the 7 years that this program has existed. There are another 13 to 16 projects under construction and another 35 to 41 that are under review. So while this may seem to be a promising program, while there's been an intense amount of discussion in this program, this was really the centerpiece of the housing debate when the mayor was elected in his first term. I don't think we've really seen a significant amount of housing production increase as a result of this program. So what did the governor do? What has this administration done? Well, the governor, I think, has maybe a few signature different policies on housing. The first of which, perhaps the most significant of which, was the emergency proclamation that he promulgated at the beginning of his term in 2023. The first draft of this emergency proclamation was extremely sweeping. It created a working group called the Building Beyond Barriers Working Group that had the power to certify projects, to give green lights to projects, that could give the green lights to projects, notwithstanding environmental laws, notwithstanding historic preservation laws, to green light them. And that was extraordinary. That was an extremely significant policy. It was the neutron bomb of housing policies that was proposed. It existed for a few months before really a huge backlash took place. I mean, it didn't even exist for a few months. It probably existed for a few days before a backlash took place. There was an enormous grassroots backlash. I was present when we got just a ton of phone calls, of emails. I'm sure the same was happening at the governor's office. And more importantly, there was a lawsuit that was filed to restrict the power of the governor. I don't think a single project was actually greenlit under this working group that took advantage of the most ambitious terms of the working group. I think that there was a lot of questions about the legality of this working group. And I guess I would say that this proposal was so radical that no state has, to my knowledge, proposed it before or even since, despite the worsening housing crisis nationwide. And so, a lot of kudos to the administration for being willing to undertake an extremely risky, extremely controversial proposal. As it happens in court next, in the NACOA decision that came down last year, the NACOA versus governor decision, this, I would say, was actually kind of an extraordinary total victory by the administration on all fronts. The only thing that the Supreme Court said to reduce or restrict the power of the governor was it said that because the first 5 drafts of the emergency proclamation applied to all housing and not just affordable housing, it did not, by its own terms, meet the definition of the housing shortage that existed. It upheld emergency proclamation 6 through the present because those restricted the application, their application only to affordable housing. The court did not define affordable housing. It did not restrict what affordable housing had to be. It did not restrict the AMI level of affordable housing. in my opinion, you could slap a 200% AMI restriction and call it affordable. I mean, even that governor's affordable dashboard, if I'm not mistaken, I think it labels a lot of 140% AMI housing as affordable, which I think most of our local families probably would not call affordable, and which I don't even think is defined as affordable under the statute. That's technically called workforce housing. But basically, the Hawaii Supreme Court has given the governor a total blank check on housing policy, a total blank check. The Tsar of Russia, the Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Kim Jong-un in North Korea does not have more power on affordable housing than Governor Green in the state of Hawaii. And I want to be clear that I am disappointed that the governor has not actually made greater use of this power. And the reason I know that the governor can and is willing to make use of this power is because he has actually done a couple of things, next slide, that show a level of ambition. The primary one of which, in the number of units, is the one on the left, the 10,000 unit RFQ that HPHA promulgated early in the term, which does not rely primarily on this fiat power that the Supreme Court recently validated. But which is significant and which is underway, and you might have seen the construction cranes, you might have seen the shovels in the ground. I understand that there's another groundbreaking taking place, potentially by the end of this year. But that is absorbing a lot of the funding that the state has appropriated over the last decade. But maybe a better illustration, just in terms of just the sheer power of the governor, is this project on the right-hand side, Kala'iola, which exists on the ridges overlooking Lahaina, Maui. Now, we all know that there was a horrible wildfire that destroyed much of the housing stock in Lahaina and killed over 100 people. Kala'iola, which I've had the chance to visit, was completed in about a year. Within a year of the destruction of that wildfire, these, I think it's about 400 units were created. Now, this is despite some exceptional challenges, one of which is the site. So they actually they selected a site that had access to water infrastructure. That site was deemed not suitable. So there was another site that was selected. It was on the side of a mountain, and they had to do enormous site preparation, including blasting their way through just enormous amounts of solid volcanic rock. And that also added a 3-month delay. So out of that 12 months, there was also a 3-month period where no construction happened because they had to switch sites. When the Kala'iola site was selected, they had to do just a wild amount of site preparation and just blasting their way through solid rock. And then they had to bring in all of these modular site homes that you can see from places like Korea and China from across the seas in a really unprecedented scale. And then they had to open them. The developer was Department of Human Services, not HPHA, not HHFDC. As far as I know, Department of Human Services has never developed one housing unit, either before or since. So it's a totally inexperienced developer. And they were able to make this, to bring this project to completion in 1 year's time at the cost of about $400,000 per unit. And I could be misstating those figures. They might not include, certain infrastructure or site preparation costs. But that site is one of, if not the most challenging site that housing has been developed in the state of Hawaii in the last, probably in my lifetime. And they were able to do this in less than 1 year, frankly, less than 9 months. Oh, and I should mention a lack of water. There's not enough water in West Maui, and they're nevertheless still able to do this project. So I guess my message is, where there's a will, there's a way. And outside of this one project in West Maui, I am unaware of even the stated desire to deliver enough housing to actually move the needle on our housing shortage. And as we've all seen earlier, the housing production in Hawaii has not gone up, housing prices have not gone down, and the exodus of young people out of Hawaii continues. So it is my most fervent wish that we take this dictatorial power of the governor and we harness it, and we build another 100 Kala'iolas across the state. All right, another signature proposal of the governor, and I know this is a signature proposal because I served with him when he was in the state senate, and this was a signature proposal of his then, are these Kauhale projects. And I was the vice chair of the Human Services Committee when he was the chair, and there were naysayers who came before the committee and said it could not be done. And yet, within about 6 years, we have 25 of these villages that exist today, 30 by the end of this year. An unprecedented amount of funding has gone into these villages, about $50 million a year. I believe this year, $88 million, again, in a very funding constrained environment, went into these Kauhale projects. I think that the numbers are starting to show themselves in the point of time counts. And so I think the visible amount of homelessness has also declined. I had a friend recently who visited Waikiki from the mainland, and he really didn't see very many homeless people. And I asked him about it specifically. So I think that's something where the needle has moved. But again, I don't see that this has changed the housing situation on the ground for all but those who are at the very bottom of the housing spectrum. All right, so my pet project, as most of you probably know very well, has been the Aloha Homes concept. Even before our first legislative session in 2019, I held a conference on this topic. In 2019, we had introduced SB 1, which was the Aloha Homes proposal. It died that year, but we were able to pass a measure to commission a study to study what this 99-year leasehold revenue neutral model on state-owned lands would look like. That study was final. This final study was actually released about 2 years later in September of 2021. And it's been a step-by-step process. Next slide. The actual act was not adopted until 2023, so 4 years after it was first introduced. It was when Act 97 passed in 2023. HCDA was now given this program instead of HHFDC. To their eternal credit, HCDA raised their hands and said, I'm willing to do this after 4 years of HHFDC, giving every possible excuse as to why they couldn't do it. $1.5 million in funding was also appropriated that year. And as a result, a number of things started to happen. Next slide. The developer Kolila LLC was selected in July of 2024. The site was selected in December of 2024, and that's the Ward Kapiolani site where the Jack in the Box is today, and the building with the Obama mural is behind it. So that those two buildings are on that parcel. The administrative rules were finalized in 2025, and pre-development due diligence has been taking place ever since. On the left-hand side, you have an appraisal report prepared in February of 2025 that lists the market values of every single condo that's been proposed at that site. So a lot of behind-the-scenes work has been taking place. Next. This year, HCDA came back to the legislature in 2026 with this bill, SB 2061, which did pass. I won't get into it now, but basically due to the soft condo market that we discussed earlier, they wanted to make a number of changes to the statute in order to allow them to market their units to a broader array of buyers than is currently allowed by the very restrictive statute that passed in 2023. So it's been an incremental progress here at the legislature. Despite all of my, we've done, I think, 4 housing delegations plus a virtual housing delegation during the pandemic. We've held these pre and post-session briefings every single year. We've introduced, I think, a record number of housing bills every single year. We've been doing a weekly housing newsletter, which is where probably many of you found out about this briefing today. The best that I think one legislator can do on a novel concept like this is just a bunch of baby steps, a bunch of tweaks, launching a pilot program, then tweaking it a little bit along the way. We still are not at groundbreaking. That might be optimistically, next year. And so, 8 years for, one groundbreaking, I would say, that's pretty slow progress. I've also made, and the legislature, I think, has also made financing reform a maybe distant if dumping money into the rental housing revolving fund was priority number one for the legislature, reforming the way those funds were spent was maybe priority number 10. A number of bills have been passed, a couple of them impacting the rental housing revolving fund directly. Last year, HB 1409, this year, SB 2060, in particular to create a mixed income subaccount. And this subaccount would, the original concept was to create a subaccount. There's an enormous amount of just cash lying in the rental housing revolving fund. HHFDC says every year, well, that funding is already committed. But the truth is that even once a project has been awarded rental housing revolving funds, it takes like 5 or 6 years for that money to actually leave the door. And so that in the meantime, that funding is just sitting there in the rental housing revolving fund, gathering dust, earning a very low rate of interest. And one of the ways that we were trying to harness that funding would be to enable HHFDC to transfer some of those funds into a mixed income subaccount to allow that funding to be used for higher AMI levels, more revenue neutral housing, where you would only need the funding for a short number of years rather than the 57 years that LIHTC financing requires. And so we were hoping we created that fund last year, or that sub-account last year. We made some tweaks this year, but we were not able to secure funding for it. In the meantime, HHFDC still has not promulgated the rules for it, so they can't really deploy the funding, even if the funding had been placed into the fund. So, again, this seems to be yet another example of just incremental change being possible without the administration coming in and using their, neutron bomb, their Thor's hammer to actually grab those funds, which the Supreme Court has given a green light to, which they definitely could do tomorrow if they wanted to. Next, we've also been trying in certain small ways to actually revolve the funds in rental housing revolving fund faster, even those that are going to LIHTC. The first effort was in 2024, HB 1763. It prohibited HHFDC from forgiving any rental housing revolving fund loan, which they had the power to do, which I thought was frankly unconscionable. It also amended the priorities for which rental housing revolving fund funds were to be used. And SB 2060 this year, which passed, went a little bit further. It reprioritized rental housing revolving fund to prioritize perpetual affordability and revenue neutrality, as well as applicants with a demonstrated history of early repayment. So I think this is really important on a number of levels. I think first of all, as we've all seen, AARP has done some really great research on this. Every single rental housing revolving fund LIHTC project that has ever been built is only temporarily affordable. And so as a result, each of them is a ticking time bomb. There are 15,000 units whose affordability periods will expire between now and the year 2100. There is no solution. At the end of their affordability periods, developers are completely free to raise rents to markets, kick out all the low-income housing tenants, and bring in new market rate tenants. In practice, what usually happens is the tenants freak out and petition the state and counties to actually buy back those units, which is forcing the state and counties, the taxpayers, to pay for each of these buildings twice, which is just an absurd, obscene, as I was quoted in the New York Times saying, state of affairs. And all of those do-gooders who would continue to dump rental housing revolving funds into the fund without requiring perpetual affordability are only expanding the size of that ticking time bomb. And so by enshrining perpetual affordability into the statute, we are handcuffing HHFDC to no longer get away with this obscene, corrupt practice of just open-ended temporary affordability for the rental housing revolving fund. It's also prioritizing revenue neutrality, which may or may not be super workable given federal requirements for low-income housing tax credit. But I think third, what is important is that a lot of times, these developers, I think in almost all instances of development, developers will refinance their initial loans with lower interest loans after the building has been stabilized, after the units have all been rented out. And that is something that developers in Hawaii have historically not done with rental housing revolving fund loans. Because why would they? They have a 57-year term. They have a 0.25% interest until 2024. They could have, they could just drag these loans out and hope that the state would actually forgive them at the end of the 57 years. So they really had no incentive to repay these just concessionary, these absurdly pro-developer loans early. But here is an incentive. They could have refinanced, and none of them chose to do so. Here is an incentive. If they refinance as early as possible and repay the state rental housing revolving fund loan as soon as possible, then they get priority for more loans in the future, collecting more developer fees in the future. And I think that that's going to be hopefully a significant inducement for those developers to repay the rental housing revolving fund as quickly as possible, and therefore to revolve these loans faster than 57 years, and therefore create much more housing for the taxpayers, bang for the buck. All right, so in 8 years, I've really changed my views a lot on housing. I think initially I probably started out as a supply absolutist in a libertarian sense. Whoever dumps supply into the market, no matter how much, no matter how much it helps, and at some point we will dump so much supply into the market that the market will become affordable to local people. I have since really changed my mind on a couple of those fronts. One is that even increasing supply by a lot, I don't think will bring down housing prices except through the extremely disruptive and undesirable form of a housing crash, which usually induces recessions, which usually costs politicians their re-elections, and which I have therefore no interest in inducing. And second of all, I think that I am utterly rock sure in my conviction now that the private sector cannot, it is structurally incapable of delivering the amount of housing that is required to actually move the needle on our housing shortage here in Hawaii. I think the private sector needs to make a profit. I think they will target the highest paying buyers first. And those are the wealthy overseas investors, and that targeting those buyers not only, well, I mean, I frankly don't care if they target wealthy overseas investors that much, but as a political matter, the voters of Hawaii cannot tolerate that. They do not tolerate that. And in the 1970s, they made a series of decisions that prevented the 1960s and 70s era boom of selling to overseas and an influx of mainland people moving into Hawaii. So the voters of Hawaii will simply not tolerate another huge private sector, privately financed boom that largely sells their units to people coming in from the mainland or overseas. So I think that the answer is the direct government housing production that the Supreme Court gave the green light to. I think that is the only hope that we have. I think that we have already made some strides to using this huge cash pile that the governor can use right now to build that huge amount, tens of thousands of units of housing that we all agree that we need. I think that if we prioritize revenue neutral projects, that will enable the scaling of the housing production that it will take to get to the tens of thousands of units that we'll need. And the broadening of the eligible buyer pool will enable us not to just focus on people who can't afford housing, but to forward on those who can afford housing. And then finally, if we reduce the procedural delays for these state-led housing projects, I think that will give the governor an easier time. Although, like I said, the governor already has a completely blank check. I no longer think that NIMBYism is the problem that it sort of the existential problem that it was. I think it's a convenient scapegoat to as a fig leaf to deliver libertarian policies that will only enrich the big developers for a few reasons. I think, first of all, we already have 201H-38. We already have multiple pathways to 201H-38, and the governor already has a completely blank check to build whatever he wants, wherever he wants, as long as he calls it affordable housing. And then finally, I just a few days ago, I was listening to kind of an interesting program on the history of the Civic Center and the architecture of the Honolulu Civic Center here in Hawaii. And it turns out that the very first church ever built in the state of Hawaii by the Reverend Hiram Bingham was going to be this huge, white monstrosity compared to the traditional Hawaiian architecture that existed in Hawaii at the time. The king, who was pro-Christian missionary, actually freaked out and said, no, we can't build this, obstructing my views and obstructing the waterfront here in Hawaii. So all the way back to 200 years ago, the king was already a NIMBY. And NIMBYism has always been with us. It will always be with us in the future. And by pointing the finger at a deep-rooted psychological tendency that has always existed in human psychology and always will, we will never be able to identify the true causes of the building booms that did in fact happen during certain periods in Hawaii's and this country's history. So anyway, that's my outlook after 8 years here in the chairmanship of the State Housing Committee. And since I've used a lot of time pontificating, let me just try to go through the Senate bills that we passed this year relatively quickly. I already covered the mixed income housing sub-account amendments. The main thing that I wanted to highlight here is that this finally does create the mechanism through the line of credit to allow HHFDC to use that huge $400+ million cash balance in the rental housing revolving fund. Those are funds that might be needed in year 5, in year 10, but are not needed today. And therefore, rental housing, HHFDC could grab those funds for 2 years, loan them out to a revenue neutral condo development, say, and then return them to the fund in just 2 years. A mechanism that could potentially unlock just a huge amount of housing financing. Next, extending the DERF equity program. This is a pilot program that we introduced back in 2023. It was one of then Housing Chair Hashimoto's priorities. If you're an eligible buyer, like a nurse, a teacher, or a police officer, HHF and the developer works with HHFDC. HHFDC will actually be your partner in buying one of these units. HHFDC will come in and buy a fraction of your condo, reducing your down payment, and then HHFDC will also capture the upside if you sell or in 30 years, whichever comes first. So HHFDC is being treated as a full partner, as an equity partner in these condos. It's being compensated for its risk by realizing any increase in value in these condos. And this year it was also restricted. This program was extended. It was also restricted to transit-oriented development zones in Honolulu and along bus routes in the other 3 counties. The funding cap was also increased by $10 million. Okay, next is the financing reform and expedited entitlements under SB 2544. This is kind of an interesting project. This past year, some of you in the audience today will remember we did a delegation to Vancouver, Canada. And the province of British Columbia introduced this program called BC Builds. It created this $5.5 billion program in which a huge amount of cheap financing was available to build below market apartments, and also to expedite the permitting and entitlement process to a 12 to 18 month timetable rather than the typical 3 to 5 year timetable. It was a personal priority of Premier David Eby, who had previously been the housing minister of British Columbia. And that's been an extraordinarily successful program. It's only been in existence for, I think, less than 2 years right now, and they already have 30-something projects. I think that huge amount of funding sort of caused all these projects on publicly owned and privately owned land to come out of the woodwork. And we're actually launching a similar initiative through this Hawaii Builds program and this bill this year. It'll be a 5-year pilot program. It'll require the same level of interagency coordination and meetings that BC Builds has, and it'll also free up $20 million in funding for projects to take advantage of this new expedited process. And so, that program in BC, I think one of the main reasons it was so successful is that it was one of Premier Eby's signature accomplishments as the Premier of British Columbia. My hope is that even though we did a lot of the work on codifying this into the statutes this year here at the legislative branch, that the governor and his administration will shamelessly take credit for this initiative and will implement it with speed and vigor and plaster it all over the TV ads of the re-election campaign, and then be at the groundbreaking of 30-something or however many projects before the end of his term as governor in another 4.5 years. SB 2338, another initiative led by the hardworking Vice Chair of the Housing Committee in the Senate, Senator Hashimoto, to basically increase the pay of the HHFDC and HCDA directors. It also increases the pay of the deputy, it creates the position of the deputy executive director of HHFDC and increases the pay of the finance director of HHFDC. We always talk about running government like a business. I think one of the features of running businesses that the public sector doesn't do well is to reward top performers and people for whom with a lot of responsibility with pay commensurate to their abilities and to their responsibility. This is one small step in that direction, and I hope it sends the signal that the legislature is willing to open the checkbook if the initiatives are there, especially in terms of financing. Next, we have some amendments to the Aloha Homes concept through SB 2061. There were a number of changes. I think one of the main changes is that under the previous statute, under the existing statute, 100% of these units had to be occupied by owner occupants forever. And that was very restrictive because you could not move. You could not rent out your condo if your life circumstances changed. You could not own other real property, whether you inherited it or otherwise. And what this statute, what this new bill does, is it requires all of the units to be offered for 60 days to owner occupants. But if they don't all sell, up to 40% of the units can be now sold to people, to non-owner occupants, as long as they're rented out on a minimum of 1 year terms to people who actually live in those units. So every unit will continue to be occupied, just not necessarily by an owner occupant. It also exempts a lot of the development work from procurement, and it allows for a 2-year period where you can own other real property so that gives you time to dispose of your other real property, whether you're an initial buyer, buying that initial round, or whether you're an existing owner who inherits property, or whether you're a secondary buyer who buys it on the resale market. So the basic concept of that, again, is to broaden the buyer pool to those who might not be willing to be locked in for forever in one of these units, but who might be moving in the future and then who might want to use the property as a rental unit as long as it's being rented to another local family. All right, next is the individual housing account program. This is a housing savings program that has existed since I think 1983. It's a relatively underutilized program. It, I think, provides either a tax deferral or a tax deduction. I think you might need to pay back the accumulated taxes, but basically you can save a certain amount of money every year that's tax-free from the state income tax into an account. The last time that the statute had been updated was in 1990, so the maximum amounts were $5,000 and $10,000 for an individual and a married couple, and the total allowable amount was $25,000. It was too small, I think, for most people to want to take advantage of this. And so we actually increased those thresholds to $20,000 for an individual, $40,000 for a couple, and a lifetime limit of $200,000, which is close to the median down payment now here in Hawaii. So it remains to be seen whether more people will take advantage of this program, but by increasing the maximums, I think it will be a more attractive program. We have the Kupuna Rent Supplement Program. Since 2024, the program has existed. There are at least 300 of these kupuna who have these shallow subsidies. They're receiving less than $500 a month from the state, from HPHA. And this year, the program was made permanent, and another $2.4 million, I think, was appropriated in the budget to this program. We already touched on the water supply maps earlier, and we also talked about tax increment financing. So basically, under the Constitution of the state of Hawaii, tax increment financing by the counties has not been permitted. It's been banned. And so this is a very common form of financing infrastructure for new development nationwide. Basically, when you put in infrastructure and you make land therefore developable, the property tax revenue is therefore expected to increase. And those increased property tax revenues are then isolated to service the debt that was taken out to build that infrastructure. Again, this is a very commonly used tactic across the country because it doesn't require the infusion of new taxpayer funds, and it doesn't require developers to come to the table with more money. But it allows the natural increase in property taxes to pay for the infrastructure that was built. So there's a bill and a constitutional amendment that go hand in hand to make that happen. This is the bill. On the next slide is the constitutional amendment. So because it's a constitutional amendment, it's going to be on the ballot in this fall's election. So it's really up to the voters of the state of Hawaii whether or not to authorize this constitutional amendment. I am cautiously optimistic that this will make a difference. The state has already allowed community facilities districts and other similar types of infrastructure financing cost recovery programs. They haven't really taken off. This would be another tool in the toolbox. And like I said, I think, if you've been on Oahu for a long time, probably we're all familiar that the two major waves of growth in the last 50 years have been in Kaka'ako and in West Oahu in the Ewa area. These two areas, I think, maybe the most significant factor in their development was the state involvement in their infrastructure. In Ewa, the state provided a program wherein a consortium of private developers came together and all chipped in and enabled the recovery of those investments by the private sector. In Kaka'ako, the state just paid for the infrastructure. And so those infrastructure improvements, coupled with large parcels being held by large landowners that were incentivized to make a lot of money, really did stimulate a lot of housing construction in those two areas. Hopefully, this will be another tool in the toolbox to enable that to happen. So with that, I think we've covered the bills, and we'd be happy to take any questions.
Awesome. And thank you so much, both of you gentlemen, for taking your time out of your day to, I think, sort of just give this recap and loop the public in on all the progress you've made. And I think we all appreciate both of your insights. Find it very valuable. So we do want to open up to a Q&A. We'll take one in person and one in line, and we'll kind of just bounce between. So I want to open it up first to questions to the in-person audience, and we'll just sort of address it to either the rep or the senator, respectively. And online too, please type your questions into the Q&A panel box, and then we can address them.
Perfect. No questions means we addressed everything and solved the crisis. You want to call Angela? Angela? Yeah, come on.
Aloha, my name is Angela Young, and I'm an advocate as well as someone who's studying for properties management with a BLEAS class. And my mother works for Century 21 Properties. And so my question is focused on the future development plans. So I want to ask, what is the best way to anticipate as a state, as legislators, future build-outs? So for example, are there communities that we will need to anticipate growth to be directed towards? So for example, Aloha Stadium, the entertainment district, the master community planning, there's a lot of transient-oriented development growth that can happen there. And also, there's going to be a lot of affordable housing projects to be planned. And the developer has a really good portfolio working with other developers as a joint partnership and to study the growth patterns in Honolulu. For example, the Kapolei development that happened because of the city council members' direction in the Oahu general planning process. How can the state study these growth patterns and then redirect and refocus into a more effective collaboration with developers to target development, right? And so I think that we will need stronger collaboration with DPP and permitting departments and the 4 counties to move forward with legislations so that the state and the counties can actually agree on something. Legislators going back and forth, disagreeing, I've noticed because I was involved in testifying for Bill 64, Bill 7, and the empty homes conundrum at the City Council in Honolulu City Council. So I noticed that there were plans that were getting stuck, especially with the ADUs. And so, legislators going back and forth, disagreeing on county and state responsibilities, I think can be something that can potentially be worked on and worked out.
We can go ahead and answer the question, and then,
Okay, thank you.
At some point, I'm happy to sit down with you and talk through some of your concerns. You want to take a crack at it, Senator?
Go ahead.
So I think in a nutshell, the question was, how do we plan for growth and coordinate with the counties on where growth should be occurring? Right, and I think if we had like no zoning, then I think where we would see the most housing development would be close to job centers, naturally. And we have in a lot of ways like artificially constrained development around our job centers. It's always been kind of wild to me that I could sit in my office in the Capitol and look 2 blocks away and see like single family only neighborhoods like right outside of downtown. And a lot of that constrained growth has come from like decades of community planning processes. So on the one hand, I want to recognize like the hard work of our county planning departments and their long range plans. And I think that in a lot of ways, they are trying to rectify maybe decisions that were made in the past. On the other hand, I think we need to do more to enable housing growth where the jobs are at. And then how does that interplay occur with the communities? Is going to be through the community planning process, but I think just recognizing that like we need to undo, I think, what has been like 40 years of damaging policy that has severely constrained the development of housing near job centers. And by constraining development in that form, we are pushing development out into our agricultural areas and doing the things that I said in the beginning we wanted to avoid, right? Forcing people into long commutes, forcing, requiring heavy investments in inefficient infrastructure as you're spreading roadways and sewer and water networks further and further out. I stay with my brother often in Ho'opili. Ho'opili is like an amazing development. It's a nice community, public space. He has a park right next to his house. But I drive to town to come to the Capitol in the morning. I leave his house at like 5:15 in the morning. And it's like, takes like sometimes like 20 minutes just to get on the highway because like there's just a line of traffic of everybody leaving Ho'opili to come and drive to town, right? And then you sit and it takes an hour to get here on the H1. If you come to the Capitol early in the morning, there's often, you can see a bunch of people like brushing their teeth in the bathrooms over here because people are often spending the night in this building, likely because they were forced to live way too far away and it's too hard to drive home and back. Like those are all market failures, I think, through overly restrictive zoning in and around our job centers. So I don't know if that answered your question, but.
I think, in an ideal world, we would have, I think like Representative Evslin described, a lot more high density development here in the urban core around downtown. I think whether or not zoning existed, I think the neighbors of those, the residents of those existing communities would petition the city and the state to block that. I think that NIMBYism, like I said, is an extremely deep-rooted psychological impulse. I think it is, from the king on down, I think everybody experiences it. And I think that it is not necessary. I think NIMBYism is a big issue, and I also think that just the half-life of housing existence. I once read that the average American home lasts for 90 years. It doesn't get redeveloped very fast. I think people, most homeowners, I think of my mother. She lives in a house in the suburbs. She is, in her 70s. She's retired. And she has no interest in being a housing developer. She has no interest in having her house demolished and, ADUs to be built in her backyard. She is not a construction manager. She's not a developer. She doesn't want to deal with bureaucracy and permits. She just wants to live out her golden years. And, according to demographic tables, she may have another 20 years left, which is a really long time. So I think most residents of single family homes are not eager to sell. And even if they were eager to sell, maybe the neighbor next door is not going to be eager to sell. So to put together a parcel large enough to build, like a significantly sized structure, is just not that realistic in an existing, single family neighborhood. So I don't expect, Manoa's been there for over 100 years. I don't expect, if I lived another 100 years, I don't think Manoa would change that much. I think it would probably be pretty similar to how it is now. And indeed, the way that this city has grown over the last 100 years has not been through redeveloping existing urban neighborhoods, but by identifying new ones like Eva. A large landowner in Eva was like, I want to develop this. I don't want this just to be sugar anymore. I want to realize value for my beneficiaries. I'm gonna develop it. And they didn't need Mrs. Chang to 200 Mrs. Changs to like die, in order to realize their dream of building thousands of units. Or Kaka'ako is another example. Victoria Ward was a large landowner. They didn't need hundreds of Mrs. Changs to die. They could just do it. Today, the state of Hawaii is that Victoria Ward. The state of Hawaii is that James Campbell. The state of Hawaii owns by far the most real estate along the rail line, which is an extremely costly transportation infrastructure project undertaken by the city with state authorization, with state funding, and which the state now, I think, has made it clear for decades needs to be the nexus, the locus of future growth. A lot of that land along the rail line is totally underutilized. Right now, the terminus of the rail line on the west side is dirt fields. And I know the planners and the developers say, oh, you can only do, it has to be within the character of the community. You can't do a 50-story tower. You can't do an 801 South Street out in East Kapolei. And I would say, why not? Like what? So what? How many, contiguous 2,000-acre parcels of state-owned, of any single landowner land are there out there in the state of Hawaii, right next to a $5 billion, $8 billion transportation infrastructure project? If we're building, 50 units an acre, 20 units an acre out there, when we could be building 500 units an acre out there, again, that will be just an abject failure of our system to take seriously the housing needs of our state. So would I like to see, dozens of towers going up at Aloha Stadium? I would. Would I like to see dozens of towers going up at UH West Oahu? Yes. I would love to see LCC demolished and replaced with, 50 towers. I would love to see HCC demolished and replaced with 50 towers. I don't think that, I don't think that, ADUs, I don't think that Manoa and Nu'uanu and Kahala and, Wahiwa are going to provide, and, Kahaluu and, Wailua and, what's another, I don't even know what the neighborhoods are out there, are going to provide, Hanalei are going to absorb the next 100 or 200 years of housing growth in Hawaii and population growth in Hawaii. And that's why we need to direct it all to these little islands, these islands of mega density in an otherwise low density state.
Thank you both. We've got quite a few questions here, so let's try to breeze through them. From one attendee online asks, is there any place in the United States that has really solved the affordable housing crisis? And I just want to add to that question, what kind of policies have they enacted and how can we mirror that?
I'll go first. I think we have different perspectives on this. Yes, our number of states, I'd say before the interest rate climb over the last 5 years, right? There was a number of, especially like southern states, who have been building lots of housing. Dallas, Texas, Houston, Austin, Texas, and with much, much higher rates of population growth than Hawaii has and stable housing prices. I think Austin, Texas is sort of a a place where they did enact significant policy reforms over the last decade-ish, because they were facing skyrocketing housing prices due partially to an increase in people wanting to move to Austin. And then construction correspondingly actually did increase, and Austin, Texas has significant declines in rent across the city over the last year or two. So I think that does show that we can make these reforms. California has been the poster child for zoning reform, and they have had a similar restrictive sort of policy regime as us, have had severely constrained housing supply. I think, as Senator Chang said, in a lot of ways, their zoning reform efforts, have not panned out, largely, I think, because of high interest rates. But one success that they have had is on ADUs, right? They have significantly reduced barriers to ADU development, and ADU starts in California have, grown like exponentially. So yes, ADUs are not going to solve our crisis, but I think they're a component of the solution.
So I think that's a really complicated question, even though it sounds simple. I was just looking at median home prices. On Molokai today, the median home price is $275,000. I've been to Molokai, I've flown over it. Molokai has to be one of the most beautiful places in the entire world, okay? And you can live there for $275,000. So I would say it's not just a question of price. It's a question of demand, of jobs, and so on. So are there places in the United States that are cheaper than other places? Yes, there are places in Hawaii that are cheaper than other places. But for whatever reason, people would rather live in Manoa for $2 million than on Molokai for $275,000. And so, I've been to some of these red state cities that people often hold up as having a lot of housing production. I've been to places like Tampa and Atlanta and Nashville, and first of all, their housing growth, it's like Hawaii. They don't grow by ADU. They don't grow by having ADUs sprout up all over Hawaii Kai and Wahiawa. They grow by kaka'ako. They grow by, Midtown Tampa is the kaka'ako of Tampa. Seaport Boston is the kaka'ako of Boston. There's an area of Nashville where all the new development is. It's their home growth is through shiny towers full of young people making tech bro salaries. Okay, and Austin being one of these examples. Now I'm old enough to remember, like 7 years ago, when everyone was saying, Tesla's building a new factory in Austin. Austin is the next Silicon Valley, and all these tech bros were moving to Austin. Austin did do some, YIMBY type reforms there, but what happened was the tech boom, hit Austin and the real estate market in Austin, and there was all this speculation, and all this housing was built that really propelled Austin into a housing bubble. Now housing prices are coming down in Austin, but I don't think that they're at their pre-bubble levels. If you were a school teacher in Austin in 2015, you are facing a much worse housing market today in 2026 than you were in 2015. And that's the reality. Maybe if you were a tech bro, you would face a better housing market today in Austin than you did in 2021. But you might have also lost your job because there was a tech bust. So the way that America builds housing today through this private sector boom bust cycle is not good. And the reason I know it's not good is because we've been through it in Hawaii. I'm old enough to remember back in the 1990s when the Japanese bubble burst, and it cost, it gave us our first Republican governor in 40 years. And there, it almost gave us a Republican majority in the State House of Representatives. And that's how pissed the voters of Hawaii were. They did not like that, decline in housing prices. So I really think we need to move away from setting housing policy by blog. We need to look at what actually happens, the lived experience of what these housing markets go through. And we need to realize what the political, what politically a community can tolerate. And so, I just don't think that we are going to, I don't think that the American boom bust cycle, I think if we go back to like a like a 1950s and 60s post-war era, housing boom. I think that might be a viable cycle. But, if you go to Tampa today, if you go to Atlanta today, if you go to Austin today, you won't find thousands of people saying, we have achieved housing Eden. We have achieved housing nirvana. They will all tell you why their housing market is more expensive than it was 10 years ago, about why the local people are being left behind. And I just want to say, just to continue to rant, a couple of years ago, the Montana Miracle was sort of championed by all the libertarian groups out there in the United States. Most of Montana does not have zoning. It is completely unregulated. Parts of Montana, you don't even need a building permit. You can build whatever you want and no government official will tell you no. And so when Montana deregulates housing and Montana blames their high housing costs on a high level of regulation, these arguments just do not pass the smell test anymore.
I know that Maka said that we got to breeze through these questions, which I think he was telling us to be quicker, but just a 4-sentence response. I think if you look, say at the housing index, you can go to the Federal Reserve St. Louis website and you can look at the housing index for any state or many cities across the country. And you go to a place like Houston, and you divide that by inflation, which you can do on the index pretty easily. You can see that places like Houston have not had these boom or bust cycles. Take the last 5 years out, which we have a crazy environment in the last 5 years with inflation prices. But the housing index in Houston has been very, very stable. I'll borrow the words of Seth Colby, our our budget and finance director, who used to be a state economist, who said the solution to the housing crisis is 15 years of appreciation slightly below the rate of inflation, right? Essentially, we're not trying to crash the housing market. We're trying to stabilize prices in a way that a lot of states in the country have achieved over long periods of time. And if you can have appreciation at 2%, it means nobody's underwater on the mortgage, and it means that over a 15-year period, you've really brought down the price of housing relative to underlying inflation. So I think that is the goal with some of these supply side solutions.
I believe we had a question in the audience. Did we? No, okay. Next question, and again, gentlemen, if we could try to keep it brief because we do have quite a few. This one's addressed to Senator Chang. Would your opinion on the RHRF change if the funds were made available as low-interest loans for the building of ADUs by local families to expand rental housing options? And I can rephrase that if you like.
Would things change if RHRF were giving loans to individuals for ADUs?
Would your opinion on the RHRF change if the funds were made available as low-interest loans for the building of ADUs by local families to expand rental housing options?
I think they would change. I think, like I said, Rental Housing Revolving Fund is going to an extremely narrow demographic. As I've argued in the past, I think that demographic has already been saturated. I know it's been saturated because a third of those people are making 30% AMI instead of 60% AMI. So there just aren't enough 59% AMI, workers in Hawaii to fill all those 60% AMI units. If they were made available for ADUs, I think, I don't know that things would change that much. I mean, we just, I'm old enough to remember 5 years ago when interest rates were almost zero. And so anyone could get a really low interest loan to build an ADU on their property. I represent a district that is very stable, that was developed, 50 plus years ago, and where most people don't have mortgages and they could tap into their home equity at a very low rate of interest to build an ADU. And that has not been, a large scale trend in my district. My district is building ADUs at a rate of about 2 per year, 2, not 20, not 20,000, not 200, just 2. So I don't necessarily think that it would change that much if we made a large amount of low cost funding available for ADU construction.
Great. And then one more addressed to you. You made mention on the governor's emergency proclamations. Could you share an example of an emergency proclamation that you would believe would be more directly accelerate the scaling of housing production in the next 3 to 5 years?
I'll tell you. Okay, I'll tell you what would happen. So this is my fantasy scenario. The governor says, you know what? It's time. I am going to be the governor that ends the Hawaii housing shortage. And by the time I leave office, the headline on the Star Advertiser will say, median Hawaii home price affordable to median income. Okay, so we have a quantifiable measure for what that means. for what it means to end the housing shortage. The median family can now afford the median home. All right, what is it going to take to get there? Well, we're going to need 10,000 units a year. We could abolish zoning in Hawaii. We're not going to get to 10,000 units a year. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to designate these parcels, such as the stadium, such as HCC, such as East Kapolei, and such as OCCC, and we're going to build thousands of units there. And I am going to wave my EP wand. I might give myself some cover, and I might appoint a Blue Ribbon Commission. The Blue Ribbon Commission would include people like retired Chief Justice Rechtenwald. It might include people like a retired police chief. It might include people like retired women's Wahine volleyball coach Dave Shoji, just people with unblemished reputations in the community, to just be able to put their names and stamp a document that says, to all the people of Hawaii, we've looked at, NIMBYs people are always going to say, I support housing, just not here. And then you're going to have people like Dave Shoji and Chief Justice Rechtenwald saying, we have looked at everywhere in Hawaii, and this parcel in front of your house is actually the best place to build in Hawaii. So we would have that Blue Ribbon Commission do its work in a few months, and then I would identify a bunch of parcels, and then build, and I would say 5,000 units are going here, 10,000 units are going there, and it has to add up to 100,000 units. And then I would start putting those units on the market. I would start doing all the pre-development. I would just start putting them on the market. And I would say waterfront Aloha Stadium, right on top of a rail station. And I'm going to offer this at $600,000 a unit. And I'm going to do this all over the place. And then we're going to have this. We're going to actually get to a number like 100,000 units that's actually going to be enough to bring the median home price that far down. I'm not going to rely on the private sector. I'm not going to rely on ADUs. I'm going to completely ignore those things. And to finance these units, I'm going to tap into that probably $500 million in the Rental Housing Revolving Fund. I have a rainy day fund that's like $1.5 billion that the legislature just put in another $50 million. The Plavix settlement, this drug that was inaccurately marketed to people of Asian and Pacific Islander descent, a drug manufacturer just gave the state of Hawaii $700 million, just cash that fell out of the sky into the state. I would take that and I would build housing, and I would use this money on a short term. The rental the DURF dwelling unit revolving fund has like $100 million cash just sitting in it. There's lots of cash out there in the state of Hawaii. Okay, don't kid yourself. There's so much cash out there, and I would just take that money and I would just start building, and I would just start building. And I think that the market might not catch up. I think if we started to put 3,000, 10,000 units of this product out onto the market, I'm not sure that it would sell at a revenue neutral level. But at least I would have done something, and at least I would have communicated clearly to the people of Hawaii, to the voters of Hawaii, that things have now changed. That we're not just going to wait around anymore and do nothing, that things will have changed, and that we have the scale enough to show, auntie is going to buy one of these, cousin is going to buy one of those, my nephew is going to buy one of these, and that enough people are going to buy these units that that the market will have changed, and that we won't be just in like kind of the last 8 years.
Thank you. This is a question for Rep. Evslin. Is there a study or working group that has analyzed the pricing impact of the single-family housing market if, for example, 10,000 units were developed over an 18 to 24 months, or 20,000 units were developed over the same period? More specifically, is there data showing whether that the level of production would meaningfully reduce current home prices?
Yes and no, right? There's tons of evidence from around the country, studies coming out, like multiple studies per year, showing the role of housing supply in relation to housing prices, right? Like Asquith and Mast, and like just on and on and on. And you can find those. Essentially showing 2% increase in supply leads to 2% or so reduction in prices as compared to what they otherwise would have been. Ballparking figures. In Hawaii specifically, UHERO has done an incredible study looking at the role of filtering for a single development in Kaka'ako, right? Their recent study that came out looking at the development of the Central. And what they showed, they could look at tax data and show a chain of moves So to see essentially what happens when this development is built, who's moving into that, what did they move out of, who moved into that unit, what did they move out of, right? And they were like going often like 5 moves back. And what they showed is that the average unit in that condo complex resulted in the availability of a unit 40% cheaper somewhere else on the island. And they showed that 80% of those units, again, looking at like tax data, were occupied by local residents. So yes, there's lots of studies looking into the role of housing supply and its impact on prices. To what the questioner is asking is like, specifically, what would happen if we built 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 homes? Not that I know of. And I think UHERO continues to do incredible work, and hopefully they can sort of maybe, come up with some modeling scenarios to look at that impact. But yeah, it's a good question.
You have one time
Okay. Let's do this all-encompassing question. Is it fair and equitable to compare Hawaii to other states since we live on an island with limited land entwined with fragile environment and cultural resources? And I'll open this up to both elected officials.
I can go first, I think, because I'm the one comparing us. And I want to be like super clear that, right, a place like Houston or Dallas, like we don't want to be Houston or Dallas. Like they've done that, again, through limited zoning and limited regulation. Houston has low housing prices, but incredibly high like commute costs because people are stuck commuting very, very far distances in Houston. That Hurricane Harvey came and like flooded the city because there's lots of asphalt, et cetera, et cetera. So the challenge that we have, and I think that most like blue cities are trying to grapple with, is like how do we enable more housing construction to try and bring down prices, which we like absolutely have to do. How do we do that without sprawling outwards and becoming Houston or one of these other places? And I think like the sad part of that answer is that we've had like the worst of both worlds in our policy regime over the last 60 years in Hawaii. Because we've made it so restrictive to build higher density housing, we have exacerbated like the development of agricultural land and our sprawl and the forcing people into these lengthy commutes without actually getting the housing supply that we want to have, right? So we have very high housing prices, and we have high infrastructure costs, and we have high commute costs, and we're consuming ag land, and we're increasing the price of ag land by increasing development pressure on it. So like yes, by all means, let's take those examples and let's take like the parts that are working and apply it here. So I think the parts that like Senator Chang and I wholeheartedly agree on is much, much higher density in and around our TOD, right? Like we do need to make it as easy as possible to develop a ton of housing in close proximity to rail stations. I think the parts where I would differ is like, I do think an ADU or ADU policy can make a material difference. Kauai, for example, we have 30,000 homes on Kauai. Our general plan shows that we have a 9,000 home deficit on Kauai. If 1 in 10 of those homes builds an ADU, that's like a third of the housing shortage. That's not a high bar, I don't think, to make a material difference. And on top of that, then let's make it easier to build more higher density housing in and around the Hui Town core where I live. So I think, yes, let's take the examples of what's worked. Let's not go down the road of what hasn't worked, and let's come up with solutions that work for Hawaii.
I think we have to compare ourselves to other states and other jurisdictions, not just in the US, but all around the world, because we are subject to the same forces. When interest rates went down across the country in the 2020, 2021 era, our home prices shot up just like they did in California, just like they did in Houston. When interest rates went up in the last couple of years, our home prices stabilized just like they did in all these other places. So we like to think that we're different. We're actually, but Hawaii housing prices, we're subject to the same trends that these macroeconomic global trends that every other jurisdiction is in the country, and in many cases around the world. I think that it's important. So we have to make policy trade-offs here. I think people in Hawaii strongly believe in the value of our natural environment here. And I think people in Hawaii really have a strong connection to their land. You don't need, you're a tourist from like Shanghai or Tokyo or New York. You get off the plane and instantly your relationship with the natural world changes here in Hawaii. We have an intuitive understanding as human beings in Hawaii that the natural world is just much more important, plays a much greater role, and we have to respect it more here in Hawaii than we would on Manhattan. And we are entirely free to make that choice as you know, through our democratic processes, to freeze Hawaii in amber and to say, from now on, the endangered EEV habitats and the endangered, you know, snail habitats are so important that we must never again build another building in Hawaii. That is an entirely legitimate policy choice that we make, and we're seeing that, I think, unfold in real time on the neighbor islands, where I think on the neighbor islands, you know, people have a much greater intuitive sense that they would rather not develop all over Waimea Canyon or Hanalei or whatever. And I am not suggesting that they change other. I think that's entirely legitimate. That's entirely legitimate, and that's indeed the choice that the voters of Hawaii have made for at least the last 50 years. So not only is it an entirely legitimate choice, it's actually what's happened over the last 50 years. I'm the one who's trying to change things. You know, Representative Evslin is the one who's trying to change things. We're trying to change the status quo where we have decided no more growth. And the reason why I think it's so important is because of our next generation of our young people, because I do care about our young people. We have about 13,000 people graduating from high school every year. We have about, you know, 2,000 to 3,000 housing units being built every year. We are telling those high school graduates, you know, 80% of them, it's great that you were born and raised and educated here, but now that you're an adult, you have to leave and you can never come back. This is not your home and will never be your home again. And I cannot tolerate that. I don't want us to live in that community, in a community of extremely rich people and honey creepers, and that's it. That's not the state that I want to live in. I want to live in a state where people do have the opportunity to, you know, to get a good job and to afford a home and to have kids and to live a good life and start a business and, you know, and to go surfing on the weekends and not be working their fourth shift in their fifth job. I don't think that the status quo is sustainable. I don't think it's sustainable to Homo sapiens. I think it might be more sustainable to humpback whales, but it's not sustainable to humans. And I represent humans. Humans are the ones who vote for me. I give birth to humans. I have 2 human daughters, and I care about them more than anything else in the world. And so we have failed the humans of Hawaii. And so it is incumbent upon us to go look, you know, high and low for where those solutions are. And, you know, I'm not going to stop doing that. I'm going to keep fighting. I'm going to keep pushing the Overton window, because not just because I believe that we need to do this. I think all the options should be on the table. I think I've never stood in the way of ADUs. I think ADUs are a great, you know, tool in the toolbox. But if, you know, the political reality is that an incoming administration has one shot to spend a lot of political capital on housing, I'm going to fight like as hard as I can to make sure that one shot is on government housing and not on, you know, a policy that I believe is going to fail. And so I've told you why I think it's urgent. I've told you what I think the only solution is. And, you know, even though it's been a lot of frustration over the last 8 years, I think that we have changed that Overton window. And I think that, you know, whenever that next shot of political capital comes in and political will comes from the next mayor, from the next governor, I think that the housing dialogue, the policy landscape is going to be a lot different than it was in 2016 or 2018.
If I can add very briefly, since Senator Chang mentioned honey creepers, I am a fan of the birds there. I just do want to say, like, Hawaii land use regime, right? 48% of land is conservation zone land, where development is essentially, for the most part, almost prohibited. 48% of land is agricultural land. Like, we set aside 96% of land in Hawaii for ag or conservation purposes. And I actually think that is a massive win, right? And our state land use law very clearly says, 1961, right, that we should be making it easy to develop housing in urban areas, this 4% of land, to preserve and protect agricultural land and conservation zone land. I think we've failed to achieve that through the policies that have come since then. And like all I'm saying is that we should go back and essentially fulfill the twin tenets of our state land use law, and continue to both protect the honey creepers from development, which I think we should continue to do, while doing exactly as Senator Chang very eloquently said, is ensure that our kids can remain in Hawaii and thrive.
Awesome. Thank you both, and thank you everybody who attended online and in person. And I think what a great way to wrap up the 2026 year. So yeah, thank you all, and of course.